It will be no surprise to you to know that I am a fan of a well lived life. A life where you give more than you take, where you are loved and you love in return, where you do the hard things that unlock your greatness. A life, in other words, where you get to be the best version of who you are. Now, it's easy enough to rally people to that vision with sweeping statements and emphatic calls to boldness and a motivational quote or three and that kind of general rah, rah, rahness. And I've done a fair bit of that motivational stuff myself in my time. But everything's more complicated when you get into the details. And I find that the struggle is often in the fine adjustments rather than in the big steps. Because it can be obvious when there's a gap, I mean, a clear gap between the person you are now and the person you know you can be. Because with a gap like that, the tension can pull you forward. You don't have to listen too carefully, and you'll hear the call to cross the threshold and start the journey. I mean, come on, let's get cracking. What can be harder is when the gap is smaller and less obvious. You're comfortable enough, you're successful enough, you're safe enough. You can spin the story that you're content. And what's more, that story is mostly true. But if you're like me, you can feel that there's something brittle in that story. There's a splinter. You know you're content, but you also feel the restlessness. There's still work to be done. There's a chasm to leap. There's a level to up. There's a new person to be. There's still something you want to risk. This dance, this tension between appreciating what you have and who you are now and what's right there in front of you, and that restlessness to keep searching for what's next and who you want to be. We unlock our greatness by working on the hard things. Welcome to Two Pages with MBS. This is the podcast where brilliant people read the best 2 pages from a favorite book, a book that has moved them, a book that has shaped them. You can sign up at 2pageswithmbs.substack.com and you'll get my short essay and you'll get the notice every 2 weeks when there's a new episode. Members also get access to transcripts and the occasional MBS solo episode. That's where I get to choose and read aloud 2 pages from books that have moved and shaped me. Jay Papasan is a best-selling author. By best-selling, I'm not talking I made an obscure sub list on Amazon. I'm talking that the first book he co-authored sold over 1 million copies, and that's not even the book he's known for. Another book that he co-authored has sold over 3 million copies, and he's appeared on more than 500 bestseller lists. The book is The One Thing, and it's a book where Jay and his co-author Gary Keller focus on getting actual results in the work you do. And this is core to Jay's goal in life and, in fact, his identity.
I identify as a creative that wants to make an impact, right? That's close as I'm going to get to who I am.
That's a powerful combination, creative, impact. And I understand some of that combination myself. And I know there's this kind of dance between them, a tension again. Because one part of me always has that next thing whispering in my ear. Oh, how about you do this? How about you try this? It's SOS, it's the shiny object syndrome. And it's a temptation for me to start and dabble, start and dabble, start and dabble. But there's another part of me that keeps murmuring to the bigger game. You know, the way I put it is to infect 1 billion people with the possibility virus. And that murmur is what keeps me moving towards focus and finishing, focus and finishing. Seth Godin talks about shipping the work. It's about getting the thing finished. 80% good and shipped is better than 100% perfect and never shipped. It's all about getting it out the door. And just imagine, I mean, to pick a name, J.R. Tolkien. What if he never finished his work? What if he never shipped? What if no lives were ever touched by Middle Earth? Well, there definitely would have been at least one ripple effect.
My sixth grade teacher, I think her name was Miss Bodderford, read The Hobbit aloud to us. And
Brilliant.
it started something for me. Like I almost looked to that book, that opening chapter about what a hobbit hole is not.
Exactly.
And I remember thinking,
green round door, the knocker. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not moist or dark or damp. It was
Like
all a
sandy
negative,
tunnels.
right?
Yeah.
To tell
Right.
you what it was. And I remember her reading that. And I then went to our little library, and it was maybe, I don't know, 12 square feet in that little, it was called Get Well Middle School. And Get Well, that street, backstory, since we're allowed to ramble on this podcast, used to be called Shotwell until they put a military VA hospital on it and they changed the name to Get Well. But I read pretty much every fantasy or sci-fi book in that library.
Mm,
I just became a voracious reader. I was undersized. You've met me now. I'm a little tall. I grew
yeah.
late in life. I was shy. I'm an introvert. And that was my refuge. Like
Yeah.
I always wanted to be a writer after I fell in love with books. Like as early as ninth or 10th grade, I was dreaming of being a writer.
Mm.
And I wanted to give that gift back. I always thought I'd be a fiction writer, not nonfiction. So I fell in love with books. Sometime in high school, I discovered I could write. One of my English professors asked us to write an essay, and I wrote kind of a narrative story about chasing a cat around my grandmother's house with a bag of flour, trying to turn it into a white cat.
Nice.
And evidently a true story. I had no memory of it, but they told the story so many times I could tell it. And it got passed all around the high school. I kept hearing, "Oh, I loved your essay." I'm like, "What? What are you talking about?" But that was like the first sign.
Mm.
And so when I went to college, I decided after a couple of semesters of farting around to be an English and a French major. But in English, I was going to do creative writing.
Jay had mentors and role models shaping his path and nudging him forward. He ended up working in publishing at HarperCollins before he fell in love, moved to Austin, Texas, and decided to become a freelance writer. Two out of three of those were good moves,
I got fired from being a freelance writer by my wife after making, I think, $18,000 my first year.
right?
Um, yeah, not successful. And I was like, she came home. I had sent all my queries to editors. I had done my research, was waiting on a reply, and I was literally playing Diablo with a cat on my shoulders. And she's like, I love you. You need a job.
Right.
And you needed to meet people. And that's when I came to work at Keller Williams. So
Yeah.
in 2000, late 2000, I joined Keller Williams. And within a couple of years, found out the founder, Gary Keller, wanted to write books, reminded him of my history at HarperCollins. And we wrote our first book together, The Millionaire Real Estate Agent. I had a month to create a business plan, and we wrote the book, all 344 pages of it, in less than 100 days.
Wow.
Just like he and our other co-author had been, they were knowledge experts. So I was kind of the
The
ghost writer on
shaper.
that
Yeah.
project. Yeah. But he insisted my name go on it.
Oh, that's
And I
great.
remember thinking, oh, I don't want my name. I knew publishing. I don't want to be attached to a real estate book track record. I don't want them to look up my sales history and it say small number because I did a real estate career book.
Yeah.
And that book went on to sell, it sold 1.6 million copies.
Nice.
And that kind of launched our partnership. We've done 11 books, 6 with our names on them. We've
Yeah.
published some for the company. So I get to say, steeped in publishing and writing books, I've discovered that I love nonfiction,
Huh.
even though I love fiction as well.
Yeah.
But I love the puzzling of how do I make this accessible and
Yes.
practical for an adult who wants to do something with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And our biggest book you mentioned earlier was The One Thing that
Yeah.
sold 3 million copies. We published that in 2013. And that's created this whole new beast of what do you do when you're not a niche best-selling author? Like if I went to a real estate convention, people might know who I was.
Yeah.
People still don't recognize me outside of real estate, but like I had a little bit of a reputation that allowed us to do other things. So there's the script. Southern boy, lived abroad, lived in New York, met a
Nice.
great lady named Wendy who you met. Writing and books is the through
the
line
theme.
through it all, from a very young age. And here I am today. I feel lucky. I get paid to write and
Yeah.
create things.
Jay, what was it with those first books? What did fiction give you or
Escape.
take you away from?
It was escape. I mean, I
Yeah.
was awkward. I was an awkward teenager. The story
Yeah.
I tell, because I remember it. It was like a pivotal moment in my young life. I grew so much between ninth and 10th grade. You know, it's not literally true, but I felt like my knees were bigger than my thighs. You know, I just sprouted.
Yeah.
And like I didn't make the basketball team in seventh grade. I was just too small and not
Right.
coordinated enough. And by the time I was a junior, I could dunk.
Right. That's a lot of
So
growth.
I go into a class in the very beginning of 10th grade,
Yeah.
and Sheila McFall, I mean, if she ever hears the story that I tell on these podcasts, I mean, I don't even know what she goes through her head. She was a tennis player,
Yeah.
beautiful, Farrah Fawcett, blonde hair. She drove a Corvette with T-tops. I mean, she walked down the hall and everybody
Yeah.
stumbled, right? It was just that, classic high school. Everybody had a
Yeah.
little bit of a crush on her.
Yeah.
And she was a great lady, too.
Yeah.
She turned to me. We'd been in the same class of less than 110 since seventh grade. And she said, "What school did you transfer from?" And I just thought she noticed me.
Right. Of course. You're like, there's one key message here, which is like, I'm not invisible anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, that was my refuge. Like, I knew I didn't quite fit.
Yeah.
They called the table I sat at in high school the intellectuals.
Right.
I ran with some guys, like, we played Dungeons and Dragons in the library in seventh
Yeah.
and eighth grade. What a great social move that was. But I mean, I loved it. My kids play it.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
we were just nerds. And
Yeah.
we were kind of smart. And everybody I hung out with was like in the beta club. They made straight A's.
Right.
And I was always not that applied. I made B's, B pluses. Go to English class. I'd get an A for content and a C for grammar.
Right.
And but hanging out with those guys, they were always class president, whatever, most likely to succeed. They were all the superlatives, even though they weren't jocks or anything like that. They definitely lifted me up. But I just remember that moment when she said, "What school did you transfer from?" Where I didn't have to have the books to escape after that. Like I started to get a bit of a social life. I got to
Yeah.
date, I got a car, a driver's license, all the things.
Other things.
Yeah.
Um, you talked about, if you had to do it would be, I am a creative who seeks impact. The creative I get, you told that story. When did you first notice the moment when impact mattered to you?
Um, when we wrote the one thing, what became really clear from the success stories is that the people that achieve the most, the businesses that achieve the most, the athletes, the artists were driven by some like inner drive.
Mm.
And we labeled that purpose.
Yeah.
And in teaching the book and sharing the book, like that's a really thorny thing for most people to unpack. It requires introspection, self awareness, and that can
Right.
be real tough, right?
Yeah.
And, and uncomfortable for most people. Like that, who am I really? Who do I want
Right.
to be? And one of the
I think
hacks,
who am I really
yes,
is an interesting version of who am I? Because like who am I really? Like beyond the glossy packaging we can all put on if need be. It's like, what's the real mess and the glory and the brilliance and the disaster and the whole catastrophe? What's
yeah,
that? Yeah.
yeah, the real me,
Yeah.
right? We all want to be seen and known for who we are
Mm.
and liked for who we are.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's a scary thing because what if I reveal that and people don't like it?
Yeah.
So one of the little shortcuts I discovered, I always associate it with Daring Greatly by Brene Brown.
Yeah.
Uh, she had a little worksheet in the back about identifying your number one value, and it came from psychology.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I had read Essentialism.
Yeah. Greg McEwen.
Love it. And he had a hack in the back where they said if they identified the top three qualities for a hire, right? Essentially, like what are the essentials we want in someone? And if they didn't score a 9 out of 10, they couldn't hire them. And I just kind of combined the two and
Yeah.
just thought, what if I identify my top three values? And if I have a big decision, like, because I was struggling to articulate this other greater definition, but
Right.
if I felt really strongly attuned to certain words, like
Yeah.
that feels true to me. And if it's not a 9 out of 10, I should just say no. And I originally started with family impact and I think wealth. That evolved with a little, I dated it for a while. It quickly became family impact and abundance.
Mm.
And then I got real honest about a year and a half ago.
And
And I,
you hate your family, so you cross them off the list.
well, you're getting close. I realized that as much as I would strive to make sure I never made a decision that was less than a great choice for my family,
Right.
I was prioritizing impact over it.
That's so interesting
So that's
and courageous to say. Like, it's a hard thing to actually say out loud, but I empathize with that. I feel the same.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I made peace with it because like it's not like I'm out there chasing money. I realized like, oh, I really want to go speak at this event. It'll be a chance to like I know that the words in our book, the ideas in it, if people embrace them, can really make an impact.
Mm. Mhm.
And those were my favorite reviews because I read your book, because I heard your talk. I started walking my daughter to school.
Yeah.
And it's these little things that people don't expect that create this kind of tidal effect afterwards. And so I just realized I was like, impact's my number one, if I'm being honest. So now
Right.
it's impact, family, and abundance. And so, gosh, that would have been, I don't know when Daring Greatly came out. It might have been 2016 ish, maybe,
Right. That
that I
sounds about
started
right.
getting
Yeah.
those notions. Yeah.
The thing about having a list of values is people assume that they're A plus B plus C. And in fact, they're A in tension with B in tension with C. It's the dance between them. It's the choices you make when family and impact are together. And it's 52% of one and 48% of the other, or it's impact and abundance.
Yeah.
How do you navigate the tensions between those three essential values for you?
Well, I first I just want to acknowledge that's so insightful that you went right there. When I used to teach this, like one of the things I said, like people say, why three? And it's because of the tension.
Right.
Like I can take any two dots and draw a straight line between them.
That's right.
A third dot, now you have to get a parabola, a
Right.
curve.
Right. Now it's
And that's that
complex.
tension. Like, can I
Yeah.
bend this so that it's inclusive of this third value?
Right.
And so I try to not say yes quickly is
Mm.
probably my number one strategy.
Right.
When people reach out to me on social, like for speaking gigs or podcasts, I have the shortcuts on your phone. A lot of them are built in. If you
Yeah.
type TY, it'll immediately transform to thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, or, be right back. There's all of those that are built in. You can custom make them.
Right.
So I created one that's just no social, all jammed together. And that got me to where I could quickly respond, Michael, I'm trying not to make quick commitments via text or social media.
Yeah.
Would you terribly mind emailing me at my email address? Then I can look at this with all the other opportunities and give you a yes that really is a yes. I'll be
Yeah.
very present. Like I tried to sell it as a win to them to give them the extra step.
Nice.
If
Yeah.
someone can't be bothered to email me, I probably shouldn't have said yes.
That's so right.
So it's a tiny little escalation of
Yeah.
engagement from them. And it also really does allow me to sit down with my executive partner, Carly, and we look at like, here are all the podcast requests or here are all
Right.
the speaking requests. And then I open up my calendar
Yeah.
and I look and say, is this a good decision? So usually, if I give myself time to actually think about a decision, I can make
Yeah.
a pretty good one.
Yeah.
It's when I make them on the fly that I usually have regrets.
Yeah. I hear you on that. I use Text Expander, which is like similar in that I've got a series of pre-prepared answers, including what's been most helpful for me, a pre-prepared way of saying no. I'm sorry, I can't do this.
Uh huh.
Because it's like painful to craft a new message every time because you're like, I'm sorry, I kind of want to do it, I kind of don't want to do it. And this just allows me with dignity and without thinking to to say no.
I learned how to do that in publishing with a typewriter
Right.
because working for David Hershey,
Yeah.
under my desk, there was always between 30 and 40 full manuscripts
Right.
from powerful agents waiting for us to read it. And I called it the rule of 5 and 50. If it didn't grab me in the first 5 pages, it was a no. If it
Right.
grabbed me in the first five and kept me past 50, I would read the whole thing.
Nice.
But if it was losing track, like a lot of nonfiction, the
Yeah.
opening is basically their proposal, the first 10 or 12 pages that was
Yeah.
very tightly thought
Yeah.
through,
They've written it 1,000 times.
and then it just falls apart.
Yeah.
And so the standard rejection, I used to try to write, hey, this book isn't right for us because.
Yeah.
And I remember gosh, Larry Ashmead, I believe was his name. He was an amazing editor, did a lot of big books. He coached me. He just said, uh, the simplest answer is just being very direct and not giving a reason why.
Yeah.
He just said, I'm sorry, this is not a good fit for us at this time. We wish you the best of luck. We congratulate you on finishing a manuscript.
Yep.
And that's it. The less you say, the less they have to argue with.
That's it.
And I had a roommate in college. I remember inviting him to do something, and he just said, no, thanks. And I said, why? And he said, friends shouldn't have to answer the question why.
That's good.
And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, okay. Those
Yeah.
thoughts coincide for me. So I love the no, right? That's huge. How do I gracefully say no? And I don't always want to, if you have a lot of opportunities coming to you, like it sounds like you do too. Like I read
Yeah.
your book and I want you on this or that. And
Yeah.
I don't want to appear aloof. I don't want to appear better than, right? I
Right.
really want to be approachable. That is who I am, but
Yeah.
and be polite about it, right? Like I don't want to hurt someone. So I love that
Right.
you put a lot of time into a thoughtful response that works, that you can just quickly put out there.
Exactly. Um, what are your criteria for saying yes?
Well, does this make an impact?
Right.
So I
And
recently
and so
started.
unpack that for me, which is like, so what's enough of an impact? Because I can make an argument anything, even my podcast and both of our listeners. It makes a small impact with some people.
So I created rules because like I'm kind of a nerd. I think that if I'm focused on impact, whatever I'm working on has to matter to me and others.
Hmm.
And I don't define the scope of others because
Right.
that's a trap. All right, you can speak on a stage like Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan, and reach millions, or you could have a one-on-one with a teenager and change their life.
Yeah.
Which one's more
Yeah.
important?
Yeah.
Like that's really so to me. I don't overthink that.
Got
I
it.
believe that I know that this matters to me, and I believe it will matter for others. And when possible, I choose an exponential over an incremental decision.
That's nice.
So can we go bigger with
Hmm.
this? Right. But it's not that's the second rule for the very reason, because I've had some one-on-ones with people that
Right.
altered my life, and it wouldn't have been the same in a class of
Right.
1,000 people. But the one-on-one made it feel very personal. I had to hear what had to be heard, and it allowed me to take action.
Because you and I are basically exactly the same person.
I don't
Right
wear a
down to
full shirt.
growing fast. Like at one stage I had stretch marks on my thighs because I'd grown so fast that my mum's like, normally you only see that on pregnant women. I'm like, I'm so embarrassed. I'm a 14-year-old boy with stretch marks because I'm growing at such a rate. Um, I could just talk to you always because I'm like, it's like talking with a more interesting version of myself. But I'm gonna ask you about the book you've chosen to pick, and I know it was a dilemma for you. You're wrestling with a couple of choices, right?
I was. The two that I narrowed it down to are Turning Pro by Steven Pressfield, which I guess has got the benefit of the recency bias, right? It was
Right,
a more recent read that resonated with me, but one that goes all the way back to college and
right.
those creative writing classes was a book called Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson. And I went with Steven Pressfield, so I'll just give a moment to
I
Dennis
want you to do
Johnson.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Dennis Johnson was a recovering addict, a poet, and he was struggling with output. And his editor just said, when you go to parties, you tell the craziest stories. Why don't you just write those? And the Jesus' Son is a collection of stories. You never know the main character's name. He's only referred to as, pardon cuss words, cover your daughters and children's ears, fuckhead. That's
Right.
it. But it's lyrical and beautiful. And because he has hit bottom in this book, he sees everything for what it is, including
Mm,
himself.
mm.
And I could just pick up that book anytime I was locked up or stuck with creativity, and something about the rhythm, the timbre, whatever it was, would unsnarl like the
Mhm.
writer in me, and I could set it aside and do my creative work.
Wow,
And to this day, I can still pick it up and just open to any page, and I know where to look on the page to find that line,
that's
right? That
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Something about his voice spoke to me artistically, right?
Yeah. Well,
So,
I'm glad we can kind of make a sly recommendation for that book.
yeah.
But you ended up choosing the Pressfield to read from. Uh,
Yes, Turning Pro.
when did this book come into your life? I mean, how did you discover it?
So, gosh, back in 2014 or 15, one of my coworkers gave me The War of Art.
Yeah, his classic.
It's classic. And I remember reading it. It's like, where was this book when I was trying to learn to be a writer, a
Right.
craftsman? When I was, in writing workshops and stuff, like you would read Eudora Welty's One Writer's Beginning.
Yeah,
At the very end, like Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, which is the classic as well, came
it
out.
is. Yeah,
But the thing, it was like Strunk and White. I mean, it was like pretty dry stuff. Or you had to go read a biography,
right.
right, to actually go and understand what does a writer's life look like? What does a creative's life look like? And The War of Art, it sounds like you've read it. I'm sure some
I
of the
have.
people, the
Like
friends of
Steven
Michael.
Pressfield was the first person I ever interviewed as a podcast guest
Wow.
15 years ago. I mean,
Wow.
I first started, wasn't even called podcasting then because the term hadn't been invented, but I started an interview series, and Stephen Pressfield was the very first person who I invited on, and I didn't know what I was doing. I don't think he knew what he was doing, but it was great. So I definitely know this work. Yeah,
Ah, right. And he doesn't even do interviews hardly anymore.
right.
So good for you.
Yeah,
I read that. Then I read No One Wants to Read Your Shit. Then I read The Gates of Fire. And I just, every year, I set a reading goal. And about 10 to 12 books are already predetermined because I've got categories.
right.
I'm kind of a finance nut, so I like to read books around wealth building, right? That's the abundance.
Yeah,
We teach a lot of people how to invest. And so, like, I want to keep the edge sharp. I want to read about my craft.
yeah,
So every year I read a few books on writing and creation. And so, like, I was like, what are my books going to be? So I just went, well, what else is Pressfield written? And I hadn't read Turning Pro and
right.
picked it up. And there's just some gems that have stayed with me. Uh, so the two pages I chose are in different chapters. They're not consecutive. So
That's
it
fine.
might
Yeah,
be two pieces that we get to talk about.
that's great.
Yeah,
Well, I'm gonna turn the spotlight onto you, Jay, and I'm gonna sit back and enjoy these 2 pages from Stephen Pressfield, Turning Pro. Over to you.
fantastic. So the first is very early in the book, and it's from the chapter called Three Models of Self Transformation.
Mm,
The first two, which I will skip, are the therapeutic model, are we sick or are we well? The moralistic, is this good or evil? And then I will jump into how this book is the third. This book proposes a third model. The model this book proposes is the model of the amateur and the professional. The thesis of this book is that what ails you and me has nothing to do with being sick or being wrong. What ails us is that we are living our lives as amateurs. The solution this book suggests is that we turn pro. Turning pro is free, but it's not easy. You don't need to take a course or buy a product. All you have to do is change your mind. Turning pro is free, but it's not without cost. When we turn pro, we give up a life with which we may have become extremely comfortable. We give up a self that we may have come to identify with and to call our own. We may have to give up friends, lovers, even spouses. Turning pro is free, but it demands sacrifice. The passage is often accompanied by an interior odyssey, whose trials are survived only at great cost, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. We pass through a membrane when we turn pro. It hurts. It's messy. It's scary. We tread in blood when we turn pro. Turning pro is not for everyone. We have to be a little crazy to do it and even want to. In many ways, the passage chooses us. We don't choose it. We simply have no alternative. What we get when we turn pro is we find our power. We find our will and our voice, and we find our self-respect. We become who we always were, but had until then been afraid to embrace and to live out.
that's wonderful.
Do you want me to read the second passage?
I do.
Okay, and
I
then
want
we'll
to
go
hear
back.
both of these, and then we'll find our way through the conversation about them.
A little later in the book, there's a chapter called Shadow Careers.
Mm,
Sometimes When we're terrified of embracing our true calling, we pursue a shadow calling instead. That shadow career is a metaphor for our real career. Its shape is similar, its contours feel tantalizingly the same, but a shadow career entails no real risk. If we fail at a shadow career, the consequences are meaningless to us. Are you pursuing a shadow career? Are you getting your PhD in Elizabethan studies because you're afraid to write the tragedies and comedies that you know you have inside you? Are you living the drugs and booze half of the musician's life without actually writing the music? Are you working in a support capacity for an innovator because you're afraid to risk becoming an innovator yourself? If you're dissatisfied with your current life, ask yourself what your current life is a metaphor for. That metaphor will point you towards your true calling.
Wow. No punches pulled on those 2 pages. Um, what's the truth that resonates deeply here for you?
Uh, I knew that a lot of my life, I was an amateur and pursuing a shadow career.
Mhm.
Like, I knew I loved books. So, like, my first jobs were in bookstores. This great little bookstore called Davis Kid in Memphis.
Nice.
It was like one of those, like, tea and tattered cover, like
Yeah,
book people in Austin. It was kind of famous in its time. And I love that. Oh, you work at Davis Kid. And I knew all the shelves, right? I got a creative writing degree. I went on to get a master's in creative writing.
right,
I went and became an editor and helped publish best-selling books.
right.
And so here I am, just
Thoroughly
kind of
adjacent to being a
adjacent.
writer.
Yeah. And in support of. And, I love books, right? So it's
Yeah,
easy to mistake the two. And it wasn't until I ran into Gary Keller in the bathroom and I'd seen one of our designers. They had only 27 employees back when I started working on a book cover. And I said, "Are you freelancing?" And Brad said, "No, Gary and Dave, our deceased, now deceased co-author back in the day, are writing a book." And I ran into Gary in the bathroom and I just said, "Hey, I hear you're writing a book. Do you remember I used to work in publishing?"
what
And
a
that
moment.
question changed everything for
That
me.
changed everything.
And he kicked me out of the nest, and on so many occasions. I can't even tell you. Like, that first 100 days was my real interview, right? I mean, I had to write 14 pages a day. And I remember writing on the wall. It was like, I wish I could have done design work back then, but I had like Microsoft Art or something, right? Uh, but it was like, discipline is freedom, right? It felt
Right,
like it should be like in some sort of Marxist poster.
right.
But it was the truth because what I realized is the days that I knew what my writing assignment was and I just dove in.
Yeah,
I just dove in head first and just said, I will not get up until I have a draft.
right,
Those were my great days.
right.
No
This is
anxiety. It was hard. It was hot. There was no air conditioning in that room. I was sweaty. I would pull the shades down until it was dark to keep it
yeah,
cool. And I would just pound away and churn out 14 pages that reflected the conversation. The days that I delayed,
yeah,
right? I need more research. I need to find a quote to kick this off. Like, I'd look up and it'd be 3 o'clock. And I knew that the next morning they'd be waiting to see pages.
yeah.
And it was
This
just a
is,
hard
uh
show. I
This is
just,
professional and amateur, as
yeah,
Pressfield would lay it out. When you're sitting down, like, my job's to write, so sit down and write. That's being a professional. That's
yeah,
overcoming the resistance.
yeah. Don't walk around with a pencil behind your ear looking smart, right? Go do the job, go do the work in a closed room where nobody watches you. And so, like, I read that and I was like, that's the perfect description.
Yeah,
And I have lived two lives, the first half an amateur and the second half a professional. And staying a professional is a struggle, right? When the one thing came out, my world blew up.
yeah,
Like, I knew I had something special. And I was like, I'm going to do everything I can to sustain this thing. But
right,
for like 3 years, I stopped writing.
right,
I was still researching because I had to go on stages and bring new things to it. But like, I wasn't really writing for about 3.5 years. And that was a hard realization when I looked in the mirror and going like, I'm a fake right now.
right.
I am a fake. I just got fired from the professional team and didn't realize it because I was still going on stages and acting like a big shot. So it just resonates. It's hard, but it's so brutally honest
Well,
about what
Jay,
it means to be committed.
so what's been the hardest sacrifice? I mean, Pressfield says being a pro requires sacrifice. What's been the sacrifice that maybe you didn't expect to make, but you had to step into this place?
That's where I would argue with him. I'd just say, are you sure it requires sacrifice? Because if you're doing your calling, does it even feel like sacrifice?
Right.
Or did you just make bad decisions before that you don't get to keep enjoying?
Yeah.
And I refuse to believe that I couldn't be a professional writer and still stay married to my wife. It might require me to communicate things on a higher level. It
Mhm.
might require me to be fully present when I'm not writing instead of thinking about my book,
Yeah.
right? It would require me to be different. So there's a part of me that would argue with him there and just say, are you sure about that? Or does that reflect the choices that you've
Yeah.
experienced or seen experienced? So
It's
maybe
interesting,
that's
isn't it?
provocative or
Yeah.
Pollyannish, but I don't want to believe they're mutually exclusive.
Well, here's how I sit with that, Jay. I read recently-ish that sacrifice, the etymology of that word means to make sacred.
Huh.
And so you can frame sacrifice as this is my loss,
Right.
but you can really frame sacrifice as this is what I am offering up to the gods to allow me to do the work that I need to do.
Ah,
I'm just starting to read Emily Watson's translation of the Iliad, and they're all about, we've got to, Jupiter's Zeus is annoyed. We've got to find cattle to sacrifice them and offer them up to the gods. But I'm like, so if you frame this as a conversation about what have you had to say no to so that you can make both the no and the yes a sacred commitment, I'm wondering if anything shows up there.
lots of stuff.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff. So well done. But I mean, I enjoy going to the movies. I
Yeah.
enjoy like a great story. Like my writer brain turns off when I'm watching a movie or watching a show. When I'm reading fiction, when I'm in nonfiction, my writer brain, because that's my craft, right?
Yeah.
I used to work in bookstores. And then when I became a professional author and publisher, going in bookstores wasn't a date night for me anymore because
Right.
I found myself like analyzing and
Me
stuff.
too.
And it's
Yeah.
not unpleasant, but like, yeah. So like I gave up in some ways parts of the bookstore as
Mm.
just a pleasure visit because now it's just a professional. This is my inventory. These are my
Right.
competitors and my
Yeah.
compadres.
This is the water I swim in. I've got to understand the currents here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many shows. Like I've never watched a single episode of The Sopranos, and people are like, "What? Never watched a single episode of like CSI, Law and Order." Like I could go to a very long list. I do watch some shows, but I
Yeah.
have to be really selective.
Yeah.
Right? Those are for the nights that like Wendy wants to hang out with me and watch a show.
Right.
And it's not for me avoiding my work. I
Yeah.
write on Saturdays. I write on Sundays. So when other people get to just tune out, I work. But like I said, it doesn't feel like sacrifice. And I don't always have to say no. I just say not now.
Hmm.
Now is my writing time, and I'm going to do that first. That discipline is freedom poster that I never made, right? And but I carry it around in my head, and I
Yeah.
just know I get up and I was like, I've got my priorities. I'm going to knock them out, and then I get to go, screw around. I can watch football on a Sunday, but
Yeah.
I'm going to have my writing done before I go meet the guys and watch the NFL game if
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
keeping up with my fantasy football. So it's not like I don't have to
Not
live in a cabin without electricity or something.
right. Like you don't have to go all thorough on us.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
what's your relationship with risk and failure? How do you understand that?
So I think for most of my life, I have this inner curiosity to know. And so I do tend to ask a lot of questions, but it's always in pursuit of, is there a bigger truth? Is
Mm.
there something I'm missing? And once I feel like I've grasped it, there's a part of me that doesn't like to be wrong. Right. And so I used to think of risk and failure as failure
Mm.
versus progress.
Right.
And it's so trite, like failure just eliminates that, or it's a stepping stone. But like I had to learn that if I'm going to pursue things that were big,
Yeah.
like writing a book or running a marathon, I'm going to fail and it's going to be public. It
Mm.
could be humiliating and just make peace with that. And I don't know. I still go through the 5 stages of grief or whatever when bad
Yeah.
things happen. I just think I've learned to move through them so much faster that, yeah, that sucked. Okay, now what next? And that's part of the journey. Like
Yeah.
people in my businesses will quit and leave. They might steal from me. It's happened, right? And these are people that you trust, and that's disappointing.
Mm.
But then you just move on, and life
Right.
carries on. If I focus on those things too long,
Yeah.
it's not worthwhile. What I need to focus on is what lesson did this give me? And it sometimes takes a while to learn that. If I learn it, then I can largely avoid that except for bad luck. And so I try to focus on this sucks. Is there a gift here? Is there a lesson here?
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about like when your friend commits suicide. I've
No.
been through grief. That
Yeah.
just sucks, right?
Yeah.
You just work through it,
That's
and
not failure. That's
it's an
just grief.
expression of the love you carry for someone who's gone.
Mm.
But there's failures, right? You didn't hit the mark. You didn't hit the deadline. The work wasn't received well, whatever it is. And it's like, okay, that sucks. But now I have to learn from that because I'm committed to keep doing it. So I think that failure is part of how we grow and learn.
Yeah.
It's just tough to swallow some days.
I think connected to that question is this one. How do you figure out what the next project is for you? Like you're wrestling with impact as your number one value.
Uh,
The dance with impact is the bigger you make the goal, the more likely you are not to achieve the goal.
yeah.
It's and when I have a quote on my desk from Rilke, a poem from called "The Man Watching," and the line I've got there is, you know, he seeks to be deeply defeated by ever greater things.
Ah,
And I'm like,
I love that. Oh God.
every time I say that, I get this like chill down my thing because I'm like, you know, perhaps like you, I feel like I've had enough successes that there's a bunch of things I could say yes to, which are effectively my shadow career. It can look to the outside world like I'm doing something, but I know it's a shadow choice rather than a bold choice. Um, and I'm kind of trying to have the courage to be deeply defeated by ever greater things.
Wow.
I'm wondering where you find how you navigate that existential question.
I heard you say in one of your recent podcasts, you used the word surf it, right?
Hmm.
Always have a surf it of ideas. I was like, great vocabulary word. Uh, I think I told you that when I was growing up, my parents were clear communicators, but simple. And
Hmm.
I remember in my first writing workshop in New York, someone used the word ubiquitous,
Right.
and I had no clue what it meant. And I leaned over to my friend Evan Ruminek, and he just used it in a sentence for me. And I was like, got it. Okay, thank you. And
Yeah.
I used to keep journals where I would write down the words I didn't know in books. I would write the definition and use it in a sentence.
Why
I've got,
you it's one of the reasons to read great books where you're like, "What is this word? I've never even heard of this word before. What does it even mean?"
so connected to what you just said is like being defeated by ever better vocabulary.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, it's a great question. I think that as if you're creative and curious, there is no shortage, right, of things that we could do. That's just always the truth.
That's
Like
true, yeah.
I now understand the book market a little bit, and I can't tell you how many times Gary or I would go, "Wow, someone should write a book about that." Like there's a hole in the market.
Yeah,
There's a problem that hasn't been solved yet.
yeah.
Thousands of those. I think I know, and this is where we go into the mystical, right? Like something calls to me in a prolonged effort. Like I wrote maybe in the last 7 years 5 different manuscripts
Yeah,
with other people or by myself, and some of them like are in third drafts, complete redos. They're not there yet.
yeah,
Like you don't go through that process unless it's something calling you from a deeper place.
right. I love
You
that
really
insight.
see that this is an opportunity
Mm,
for you, like it calls to you. So like the nature of the work that I like to do, like throwing out a PowerPoint about something or a 20-minute speech, that's different. Sure, I'll do that. And I can do that. I can take that angle.
yeah,
Um, but like to write a book or make something that I want to put out in the world with my name on it that lasts,
yeah,
I've really got to be passionate about it. So we have a process when we sit down and we really get serious. Like the first question we ask is when someone finishes this book that we haven't written yet, what's the first thing they're going to say about it?
Mm.
And what's the first thing they're going to do differently? And we try to get really, really clear about that. And if we aren't clear, we're not ready yet,
Yeah.
because we aren't working backwards from some
Right.
reader goal. And if the answer is kind of boring, like we're probably not going forward,
I love
right?
that. Yeah.
Right. Oh, they're going to save, 10 cents every time they buy eggs. Yeah, probably not. Um, but it's, yeah, like the one thing we were very clear throughout. I wanted people to ask in a real and meaningful way, what's my one thing?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
approach that with real curiosity. What's my one thing? And that's why, like on the back of the book, we put a question mark. No testimonials, none of that. Like we just want them. They close the book and they're
Yeah.
confronted with
That's
this thing.
great. That's great.
And it allowed us to cut the book by 40% at the end. Like,
Hmm.
what does not add up to this? And there's still, like, I go back today, we're thinking about a second edition. I'm like, I'd probably still cut that chapter. We
Yeah.
weren't we weren't murdering our darlings quite well enough
Yeah.
back then.
You know,
But
they say all writing is actually just great editing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree with that. Even though that's the hard, for me, the unfun part.
Yeah.
Probably
Yeah.
why
Sure.
I moved from being an editor to a writer. But I don't know. I think I have to test the idea for a while.
Mm.
Again, time. I give myself more time to consider it. And if it's not boring, man, that's great. I had
Yeah.
a writing professor, Jessica. She wrote a book called The Dog Eaters, Jessica something. She was Filipino and in NYU. She would write a draft of a short story, turn it over, and then write it from memory.
That's great.
And she's like, if I couldn't remember the good lines, they weren't that good.
Yeah.
And she would go through that again and again until like its essence showed up. And I was like, I think that if I keep coming back to an idea, and I've got folders and folders where I dump stories and ideas, if it never just hammers on my consciousness to really dive in,
Yeah.
probably won't get to it
Yeah.
right at this
I
stage.
have a folder too where I keep throwing in ideas. And what's interesting is when I pull it open, there's one idea that I'll have written down 96 times because I keep forgetting that I've had the idea. I'm like, oh, this is a great idea. And I'm like, okay, one idea 96 times and seven other ideas. I should do that one idea the
Yeah,
96 times.
it's all different flavors. I had a moment like that when I was trying to articulate the standards or rules that connect to my values. I looked back at the essays I'd been writing. And I was like, oh God, I've been writing about this for almost 2 years.
Yeah.
I was like, this has got to be like, for me, that wasn't a book. That's got to be a chapter in the next version of this
Yeah.
because it's now connecting. Like I've been unconsciously making these connections for like 18 months. And then it all comes and shows you at the surface the 96
Yeah.
versions of the same idea. Like, okay, yeah, my brain is working on this when I'm not consciously working on it. That tells me something. It matters to me.
Hey, Jay, one of the things that I notice about you is from the outside anyway, it appears to be that one of your superpowers is collaboration. Like you co-write books with people. You share a business, as I understand it, with Wendy. You have been a publisher, which is a dance with the writers whose hearts you break as you edit and create their books. Um, it feels like you know something about collaborating that others might not. What 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 have you learned about the secret to being a great collaborator?
That's either a secret or it's part of my shadow career,
Ah,
right?
ooh, yeah, I
You
hear
know,
you.
that line, are you working with an innovator because you're afraid to pursue your own?
Yeah,
Um, my calculus, like people ask me, why don't you go off and do it on your own? And Gary said, why don't you write that book on your own? And my calculus has been since at least since I've been clear these last, half dozen years, like I think because of his accomplishments and his track record,
right.
when we do it together, it magnifies our impact. And it's
Got
many
it.
multiples of what I do alone. And frankly, we make each other better
Yeah,
still.
yeah.
We've got a kind of a work marriage thing going on. He's my work wife.
Yeah,
Um, I think that no one succeeds alone, right?
yeah.
It's kind of a mantra. And nothing extraordinary happens by a single person. Think of all the great writers, and most people don't even know who Maxwell Perkins was.
I don't.
He was the editor
Right.
behind Fitzgerald, Hemingway, you name it. You're like,
Right.
holy crap, this is the guy that edited all of those giants of literature. Oh, they did have something in common.
Right.
They had an editor that helped them identify the works that would become, the great American novels or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
So there's always that person if you look deep enough in the background. So once you get over this idea of the lone genius,
Yeah. So
which is
overrated.
so easy, like in the performative world of social media to put out there,
Yeah.
um, everybody has those people. So you just ask the question, how do I identify them?
Mm.
How do I decide the ones that I could or couldn't work with?
Yeah.
And then how do we collaborate? And all collaboration, I think, begins with really good expectations. Here are the
Right.
expectations that we're giving to each other for each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
And that leads expectations is the front end of accountability.
Right.
Here's what you can expect to me. Like that first book was, you give me the ideas that morning, and the expectation was that I would have a first rough draft done by the following morning.
Right.
And not to do that was not to meet expectations.
Well,
So
that's quite the furnace you're in.
it was great. Again,
Yeah.
discipline is freedom. I was like, wow, I would have never thought that was possible for me.
Yeah.
But I just strung together, I don't know, 100 days of writing a term paper,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Which I had plenty of practice doing on the last day in college, right?
I hear you on that.
So I think expectations, communication, and accountability.
Yeah.
And if you can be honest on those three things, you can probably make it work. If you started with the right people to begin with.
Yeah.
Like I want to work with people who are pursuing similar outcomes, right? We're fairly aligned. Doesn't have to be perfect, but directionally, we're kind of aiming for the same outcome.
Yeah.
And I like to work with people who are somewhat unselfish.
Yeah.
I mean, Gary did not give me a choice about putting my name on that first book. I
Right.
said, put it on the inside, put me in the acknowledgments. That's what's done. He goes, that wouldn't be truthful. I was like, okay, I'll be a with Gary Papasan. And I mean, that was a career changing moment because he was coming from a place of unselfishness and integrity.
Generosity. Yeah.
Yeah. And he also knew that I would be accountable. Like
Yeah.
that was our audition for could we be partners on this journey for longer? And it's pretty much held up.
Hey, Jay, this has been such a great conversation. I'm sad to bring it to an end. I've got a final question for you, which is what needs to be said that hasn't yet been said in this conversation between you and me?
I would go back to the shadow work.
Mm.
And I think that is the seductive thing. And I think it happens particularly if you've been successful,
Yeah.
is that the things that come with maintaining success are not what got you there, right? We've all heard
Right.
that saying, but it's so seductive and easy.
So seductive. I
And
hear you.
so I just think that acknowledge and be real about our shadow work and shadow careers. I think, what's his name? Astro Teller.
Yeah. The
He has
guy
this,
from X.
he talks about pedestal building.
Yeah.
Have you heard that metaphor?
I haven't. No.
If you're going to do something really difficult, and he gave something absurd, you're going to teach a monkey how to quote Shakespeare while standing on a pedestal.
Right.
Don't start by building the pedestal.
Right.
The
Did I,
hard
did I
thing,
read that in your book? I think I must have. I read it in. Is that in the one thing?
no, I wrote about it in one of my newsletters.
Okay, maybe that's where I came across it.
'Cause
Yeah.
it struck me, and I was like, pedestal building, that's shadow work, that's performative work.
Right.
Like, look what I built, boss. Look what I built, partner. Look what I built, kids and wife. I
Yeah.
built this
Yeah.
amazing pedestal today. Well, how's the
Yeah.
monkey coming?
Yeah. It's like, yeah. Oh,
Well,
the
ask
hard
about
thing,
the monkey.
the really hard thing. I haven't started that yet.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's just do the work. That Pressfield brutal truth. Like,
Yeah.
be a pro. Show up and do the hard work first. The rest kind of takes care of itself.
Jay had a throwaway line early on talking about his geeky Dungeons and Dragon friends at school. I had friends like that. I was a D&D player myself. He said, they definitely lifted me up. Now, I'd known of Jay and his books for years, but I met him for the first time in person last year at a gathering of other best-selling authors, people who were still curious and ambitious enough to keep selling their books. Honestly, it was a fantastic couple of days. It was hosted by Don Miller, author of the Story Brand book, which I love, at his place in Nashville. And I realize now, just as I wrote this out and I'm talking about it, that in some ways this was a version of that high school moment of Jay's. It's a moment where you get other people together who geek out about the same stuff you do, and people who have the same values, the same spirit, the same ambition, if you like, and you see how you can lift each other up. Get people together, lift each other up. I've got two guests from the pod who might lift you up, particularly if you enjoyed my conversation with Jay. Chris West, who I actually met at a wonderful conference, the House of Beautiful Business, a couple of years ago. That episode is number 98 and called And the Walls Became the World. So called because he read Where the Wild Things Are. It's such a great choice of a book. So Chris West. And then the other person whose episode you might enjoy is McKinley Valentine. She writes one of the best newsletters, so brilliantly curated. It's episode number 140, and it's called How You Get Good at Something. So do check those out. If you would like more of Jay, his book is everywhere. He's easy enough to find. You just Google Jay Papasan, but why not go straight to his website, jpapasan, JAYPAPASAN.com. Now, you can support this podcast by signing up for the Substack newsletter, joining as a paid member if you'd like the cool bonuses, recommending episodes to people you love, that I do really appreciate, and leaving a review if you're so moved. Doing any one of those things would be lovely. Doing more than one would be just thoroughly delightful. And as I love to say, as a way of saying goodbye, you're awesome and you're doing great.